Welcome to the Deep Dive. We've got a stack of sources here all about the U.S. during World War II.
Right.
And today, our mission is really to dig into this material, sort of cut through the noise, and pull out the key stuff. The moments, the decisions that really shaped America's role and what came after.
Exactly. Think of it like a guided tour, but focused. We'll hit the entry into the war, those really tough early days, the incredible mobilization back home, the social side of things, which was complex.
Yeah.
Then the big turning points on the battlefield, the A-bomb, and how they started shaping the post-war world even before the war ended.
Okay, so not just a timeline, but really understanding what mattered, what changed, and, why it's still relevant. Let's dive in.
All right. So setting the scene, how the U.S. actually gets pulled in. Pearl Harbor wasn't the start globally, obviously, but for America.
That was the flashpoint, December 7th, 1941. And the reaction was immediate. War declared on Japan the very next day, December 8th.
And then, bam, just 3 days later, December 11th, Germany and Italy declare war on the U.S. Japan's allies.
So just like that, full-on global war, multiple fronts.
Yep. But what's interesting is the attack came from Japan, but the big strategic call made with Britain pretty quickly was Germany first.
Right. Focus on Europe before turning full attention to the Pacific.
That was the bedrock strategy, and they formalized the whole alliance structure fast. January 1st, 1942, barely weeks later, 26 nations in Washington, D.C., signing the Declaration of the United Nations.
Creating the Grand Alliance. And they agreed, crucially, no separate peace deals with the Axis.
Exactly, and reaffirming the Atlantic Charter principles.
But having a strategy and an alliance, well, it didn't mean instant success, did it? Those first 6 months of 42 sound pretty grim, according to these sources.
Oh, incredibly grim. You read this stuff, and you realize victory was absolutely not a sure thing then.
So just how bad was it? What was Japan doing in that early phase?
Their speed was just astonishing. By the end of 41, they'd already grabbed U.S. islands, Guam, Wake, the Gilberts.
Okay.
Then by spring 42, they had Singapore, the Dutch East Indies, Malaya, Hong Kong, Burma. Taking Burma was huge strategically.
Why Burma specifically?
It cut the Burma Road. That was the main supply line overland from India into China, helping Chiang Kai-shek fight the Japanese there. So cutting that was a major blow.
And it wasn't just land, it was resources, right?
Massive resources. The sources list these figures. 95% of the world's raw rubber, 70% of the tin, 70% of the rice.
Wow.
Plus, oil from the Dutch East Indies fueled their whole war machine. Rice from Indochina fed their troops. They suddenly controlled this vast economic engine.
And millions of people. Something like 450 million.
Yeah, and they tried to play the anti-colonial card, Asia for the Asians, the Greater East Asia co-prosperity sphere.
But the reality was different.
Often brutal, forced labor, abuse. Even where they granted some limited independence later, like Burma or Vietnam, and resistance continued, like in China.
One of the really painful early moments for the U.S. must have been the Philippines. MacArthur.
Right. 20,000 U.S. troops pushed back to the Bataan Peninsula. Eventually, they had to surrender.
Which led to the Bataan Death March. Just horrific stories from that.
Absolutely horrific. 85 miles, torture, people burned alive. MacArthur himself was ordered out to Australia. That's when he made the famous "I shall return" promise. He took command of all Allied forces in the Pacific then.
And meanwhile, in the Atlantic and Europe, things weren't exactly going smoothly either.
No. German U-boats were decimating Allied shipping, sunk 8 million tons of supplies. That includes a quarter of the aid going to the Soviet Union, which was critical.
And on land.
By fall 42, the Germans were at the gates of Stalingrad, deep inside Russia. And in North Africa, they'd pushed all the way to El Alamein in Egypt. Things looked bad.
So amidst all this defeat, the Doolittle raid in April 42, it must have felt important, even if small.
Psychologically, yes. Militarily, not a huge impact, a token raid on Japan. But for American morale, after Pearl Harbor, the U.S. hadn't really struck back directly, so yeah, it mattered.
Okay, so this early period really hammers home the scale of the crisis. The U.S. jumps in and immediately faces this massive multi-front disaster unfolding. It shows just how precarious things were.
Absolutely. And it underscores why the response on the home front had to be so total. Which brings us to that incredible mobilization effort.
Right, the transformation of American society itself. Let's start with the military side.
Okay. Selective service, the draft gets expanded massively after Pearl Harbor. Men aged 18 all the way up to 65 had to register.
65, wow.
Yeah. And enlistment terms changed. You're in for the duration, plus 6 months after the fighting stopped.
And women played a huge role too, not just Rosie the Riveter in factories, but in uniform.
Definitely.
Yep.
258,000 women served in the WAs, the Waves, the Waves.
In what kinds of jobs?
All sorts of critical non-combat roles. Medical, technical support, flying planes stateside to ferry them to bases, even cryptography breaking codes.
So by the end, 16 million Americans had served. That's staggering.
It is. And interestingly, the sources note relatively little dissent compared to World War I. Only about 72,000 conscientious objectors. Very few jailed for refusing to register.
But, and this is a big but, highlighted in the material, nearly 1 million African Americans served in segregated units.
Yes. That stark reality runs right through this period of supposed national unity. We'll definitely circle back to that.
Okay, but first the economic side. Just as massive a shift.
Totally. You get these new government bodies like the Office for War Mobilization, OWM, the War Production Board, WPB, basically czars overseeing the whole economy.
Their job was to ramp up war production.
And how? Redirecting everything. Half of all factory output went to war materials. Think about that. Half.
And the result?
By 1943, the U.S. alone was producing twice as much stuff as Germany, Italy, and Japan combined.
That's unbelievable. An arsenal of democracy in action.
Truly. And that needed workers. Which leads us to Rosie the Riveter.
The icon. Over 5 million women joined the workforce, many in jobs they'd never done before.
Yeah, assembly lines, heavy industry, propaganda pushed it hard. Films, posters, even women's magazines were talking about how women's supposedly smaller hands were perfect for delicate factory work.
A bit patronizing, maybe, but it got women into these jobs.
It did. And those jobs often paid better, boosting family incomes. That helped lay groundwork for post-war consumer spending.
But it wasn't equal pay, was it?
Not even close. In 1945, the average woman worker earned less than 2/3 of what a man earned. And after the war, huge pressure for women to go back home.
This whole economic shift also changed where people lived, didn't it? The rise of the Sun Belt.
Exactly. War industries popped up all over, but especially drawing people to California and the South. It started that big demographic shift away from the Northeast, which had huge long-term consequences for population, power, everything.
Now, all these people working, earning money, the fewer things to buy because factories are making bombs, not Buicks. That sounds like a recipe for inflation.
Huge risk. Too much money chasing too few goods. The government knew it had to step in hard.
How did they manage it?
Several ways. The War Labor Board tried to keep wages basically level with the cost of living maintained standards, not necessarily improve them during the war. That helped avoid some of the strikes that happened in WWI over inflation.
And price controls. Rationing.
Yep. The Office of Price Administration, OPA, froze prices and rents at March 1942 levels. And then came rationing.
How did rationing work day to day for people?
Two main ways. For big stuff like cars or tires, you needed a certificate from a local board. Apply, get permission.
Okay.
But for everyday things, meat, coffee, sugar, gasoline, it was the coupon plan. Families got books of coupons based on household size. No coupon, you couldn't buy it, even if you had the money.
Did it work? Control inflation.
Remarkably well. According to the sources, WWI saw cost of living jump 170%. WWII, less than 29%. Big difference.
How did they pay for all this? The war effort itself.
Taxes went way up. Lots of people paid income tax for the first time ever. The number of tax filers exploded 4 million in 39 to 50 million by 45. But taxes only covered about 2/5, the pay-as-you-go part. The rest, borrowing. The national debt went through the roof. $49 billion in 41 to $259 billion by 45.
So the combination of the New Deal and then WWII spending, that created this huge government footprint. The warfare, welfare state idea.
That's the term used, yeah. It fundamentally changed the scale and scope of the federal government.
Amidst all this control and mobilization, how was the general mood? The sources mention less hysteria than WWI.
Seems so. More volunteerism, less pressure to conform, generally speaking.
But there were still labor issues. Strikes.
Oh, yes. Despite the War Labor Board, strikes happened. John L. Lewis and the United Mine Workers had a big one in 43 after being denied a raise. 450,000 miners walked out.
And the government response.
The Smith-Connolly Anti-Strike Act of 1943. It let the government seize mines or factories shut down by strikes if it hampered the war effort. It was temporary, though, expired in 47.
And science, too, got pulled into the war effort.
Massively. The Office of Scientific Research and Development, the OSRD, was set up even before Pearl Harbor. Led to breakthroughs in radar, insecticides like DDT, lots of crucial tech.
Which leads directly to the biggest, most secret project of all.
Mm-hmm.
The Manhattan Project.
Right. Established officially in 42, the goal, build an atomic bomb before the Germans did.
Based on that warning FDR got from Einstein and Fermi back in 39.
Exactly. They warned him about German work on nuclear fission. So the U.S. launched this massive, top-secret effort spread across multiple sites involving international scientists.
But the place we always hear about is Los Alamos.
Right. Los Alamos, New Mexico. That was the lab, led by Dr. J. Robert Oppenheimer, specifically tasked with designing and building the bomb itself.
And the first test.
Codenamed Trinity. July 16, 1945, near Alamogordo, New Mexico. A terrifying success.
Looking back at this whole home front section, it's just mind-boggling. The entire country remade itself. It wasn't just support for the war. It was the war for millions.
It absolutely was. And that incredible pressure cooker environment, well, it also forced a lot of existing social problems right out into the open.
Yeah, the sources really dig into the complexities here. Discrimination, social change. Let's start with African-American civil rights.
Okay. You had this huge migration of minorities, especially African Americans, moving to cities for war jobs.
Right.
That led to intense competition for scarce resources, especially housing, and friction in the workplace. It was a powder keg.
And sometimes it exploded. The sources mention violence in dozens of cities.
47 cities, yeah. The worst was the Detroit race riot in June 1943. Just awful. 25 black people, 9 white people killed. Needed 6,000 federal troops to restore order. Millions in property damage.
In that climate, A. Philip Randolph stepped up, head of the Brotherhood of Sleeping Car Porters.
Right. He really hammered the point that black workers were being shut out of the best-paying defense jobs.
And he didn't just complain. He made demands.
Clear demands. Equal access to defense jobs, desegregate the military, and segregation in federal agencies.
And he backed it up with a threat.
A powerful one. He proposed a massive Black March on Washington in 1941 if the demands weren't met. This became the March on Washington movement.
How did Roosevelt respond?
FDR blinked, partly. He issued Executive Order 8802 in June 41. It created the Fair Employment Practices Committee, the FEPC, to investigate discrimination in defense industries.
So Randolph got something, but not everything.
Crucially, no. FDR did not agree to desegregate the armed forces or federal agencies then, but the FEPC was significant enough that Randolph called off the march.
Did the FEPC actually do anything?
It pushed agencies, training programs, and defense contractors to stop segregation in those specific areas. It had an impact. The sources even say Randolph got called the father of the civil rights movement for it.
And organizations like the NAACP grew.
Massively. From 50,000 members before the war to 500,000 by the end. Huge growth in activism and organizing.
The source material also mentions Adam Clayton Powell from Harlem being elected to the Senate in 1944.
Yes, that's what the material states. Elected to the Senate in 44.
Okay. What about other groups? Mexican Americans face issues too, right?
Yes. On the one hand, the need for farm labor led to the Bracera program government policy bringing in temporary workers from Mexico.
But there was also tension, like the Zoot Suit riots.
Right. In L.A., 1943, young Mexican Americans wearing these distinctive zoot suits became targets for violence, especially from sailors on leave. Terrible attacks, clothes torn, haircut.
And the initial reaction blamed the victims.
Radio reports did, yeah. But a city committee, led by Earl Warren actually, investigated and found the truth was more complex, also pointing to bad housing conditions as a factor.
But when we talk about violations of rights during the war, the internment of Japanese Americans is just staggering.
It really stands out as the most egregious violation of civil liberties. It started with FDR's Executive Order 9066, February 42.
What did that order do?
It let the War Department declare the West Coast a war theater, which basically gave them the green light for what came next.
The forced removal
of 110,000 people of Japanese ancestry, driven by paranoia after Pearl Harbor, fear they might be spies or saboteurs.
And this included American citizens.
Absolutely. About 2/3 were Neisei, born in the U.S., citizens. Many were kids. The other third were Issei, born in Japan, ineligible for citizenship then.
How did the removal happen?
General John DeWitt oversaw it. People often had just 48 hours notice to sell or dispose of everything, homes, businesses, belongings. They typically got pennies on the dollar, maybe 5% of the value.
Then sent where?
To 10 remote camps in desolate parts of 7 states, barbed wire, guard towers, harsh conditions.
Yet the sources say many remained loyal. Some even fought for the U.S.
It's remarkable. Despite everything, loyalty remained strong for many. And after 1943, about 17,600 Nisei served in the U.S. Army, often with incredible bravery, like the 442nd Regimental Combat Team.
The material also notes this only became necessary because other states wouldn't take them.
Yeah, when the idea of relocating them from California came up, other states basically said no thanks, which pushed the government towards the camp solution.
And Japanese Americans were the only group targeted like this, even though the U.S. was fighting Germany and Italy.
Correct. They considered action against German and Italian nationals, but only people of Japanese descent were singled out for mass removal and internment by the government.
Why? What were the stated reasons?
Officially, the Army cited potential espionage, fear of a fifth column. But the sources also point to economic motives, labor groups, business groups who wanted them out of the way. Racism, pure and simple.
Was this challenged legally?
Yes. Most famously, in Korematsu v. U.S., the Supreme Court upheld the internment, basically saying they wouldn't second-guess military necessity in wartime.
But they didn't say people could be held forever.
No. The court also ruled people couldn't be held once their loyalty was established. But by that point, the war was ending and the camps were closing anyway.
The human and economic cost must have been immense.
Devastating. $105 million in lost farmland, $500 million in yearly income gone, plus personal savings wiped out. And crucially, not a single documented case of espionage or sabotage by any Japanese American, citizen, or immigrant on the West Coast.
When did things finally change? When were they released? When was their redress?
The camps closed finally in March 1946, but real redress took decades. It wasn't until 1988 that President Reagan formally apologized and signed legislation providing reparations $1.25 billion in principal.
And individual payments.
In 1990, Congress funded payments of $20,000 to each surviving internee, a symbolic but important acknowledgement.
So the home front picture is incredibly mixed. Unity and sacrifice, yes, but also deep injustice in the beginnings of major social change movements.
It's that complex reality, and while America was grappling with itself internally, the war itself was slowly but surely starting to turn.
Okay, let's shift to those key turning points on the battlefields. The Eastern Front, First Stalingrad, the sources call it maybe the most important battle.
Perhaps most important battle of the war, yeah. Starting September 42, its significance. First major land defeat for the Nazis. It broke the momentum of their invasion and marked the start of their long, bloody retreat westward, all the way back to Berlin by 45.
And Stalin was putting pressure on the Western Allies for a second front the whole time.
Constantly. He felt, understandably, that the USSR was bearing the brunt. The sources say he never really forgave Churchill and Roosevelt for not opening that Western Front earlier, opting for North Africa instead.
Let's talk about North Africa then. Operation Torch.
Led by Eisenhower. According to the sources, the invasion kicked off November 8th, 1943.
Wait, 43? Are you sure? I thought Torch was earlier.
The source material we're working from specifically says November 8th, 1943 for Operation Torch. We have to stick to what the sources provide.
Okay, sticking to the source. November 8th, 1943. What was happening there?
Well, the British had already been fighting Rommel's Panzers, the Desert Fox, since 41. Torch was a massive Allied landing, 100,000 troops hitting Algeria and Morocco.
And the key battle there?
El Alamein. A major British victory that, combined with Torch, basically spelled the end for the Nazis in North Africa, pushed Rommel back into Tunisia, huge German losses.
After North Africa, the next logical step was Italy.
Exactly. Commanded by General George Patton, Allies land in Sicily July 10th, 1943, took the island in about a month.
And this had political repercussions in Italy.
Big time. Mussolini got ousted by his own fascist party officials. Power shifted quickly.
And the Allies pushed up the Italian peninsula.
Yep. They marched into Rome on June 4th, 1944, the first Axis capital liberated, though fighting in northern Italy dragged on until spring 45.
Okay, so while Italy's happening, the big one, the Second Front of France, finally gets underway.
Yeah.
D-Day, June 6, 1944.
Operation Overlords. Another one the sources call perhaps war's most important battle, commanded by Eisenhower.
The scale was just immense.
Unbelievable. 120,000 troops hit 5 Normandy beaches on that first day. Within 3 weeks, 800,000 more ashore. Eventually, 3 million Allied personnel involved. It showed how critical winning the Battle of Britain years earlier had been, ensuring air cover.
But the cost on D-Day itself was heavy.
Very heavy. About 2,245 Allied soldiers killed, nearly 1,700 wounded just on June 6th.
But it worked. The Second Front was open. Stalin must have been relieved.
Immensely. By August 25th, Paris was liberated. By the end of summer, France, Belgium, Luxembourg freed. The strategic importance, huge. The sources argue if D-Day failed, Hitler could have shifted everything east, maybe forced a deal with Stalin, and kept control of most of Europe.
So after Normandy, the push into Germany began.
It involved intense bombing first. Hamburg practically wiped out in 43. Berlin, other cities, factories, oil refineries hit relentlessly.
Then the ground invasion.
Reached the German border by mid-September 44. Initial attack repulsed, though.
And then came Hitler's last big gamble, the Battle of the Bulge.
December 44. A massive German counteroffensive against U.S. lines in Belgium and Luxembourg caught the Allies by surprise initially, cost nearly 80,000 U.S. casualties.
But they held.
Yes, thanks to forces like Patton's Third Army and the defenders at Bastogne, like the 101st Airborne, they stopped Hitler's last major push. By January 45, the Allies were advancing again.
The final months in Europe sound brutal.
Very. Heavy bombing continued, the firebombing of Dresden is mentioned, horrific casualties. Then in April 45, the U.S. closes in on Berlin from the west, Soviets from the east. German forces in Italy collapse. Mussolini caught and killed by Italian partisans.
And Hitler.
Suicide in his Berlin bunker, April 30th, 1945.
Leading to surrender.
Unconditional surrender, May 7, 1945. VE Day, victory in Europe.
But the war wasn't finished. The Pacific fight was still raging.
Absolutely, and there were key turning points there much earlier, actually. Coral Sea, May 42. First naval battle fought entirely by aircraft, stopped a potential Japanese invasion of New Guinea and Australia.
But the really big one was Midway, right? June 42.
Definitely the turning point in the Pacific. The U.S. had broken the Japanese naval code, which was a massive advantage.
What were the Japanese losses?
Yes, catastrophic for them. 4 of their best aircraft carriers sunk, out of 10 total. 7 other warships, 250 planes. After Midway, Japan really couldn't realistically hope to threaten the U.S. mainland anymore.
An interesting point the sources make. Midway happens before the internment camps were fully established and filled.
Yeah, the timeline is striking there. The perceived threat level changed dramatically after Midway, yet the internment policy continued.
After Midway, the U.S. strategy shifted to island hopping.
Right, starting in 43. The idea was, don't try to take every single Japanese-held island, bypass the strongholds, use air and sea power to neutralize them, and seize key islands needed as stepping stones closer to Japan.
The first big land victory using this approach.
Guadalcanal, in the Solomon Islands. August 42 to February 43. 6 months of absolutely brutal jungle fighting. But it was the first time the Japanese were defeated on land.
And as the U.S. got closer to Japan, the fighting got even fiercer. Iwo Jima, Okinawa.
Unbelievably fierce. Iwo Jima, February 45. Taking that volcanic island was vital for air bases, letting fighters escort B-29 bombers all the way to Japan.
And Okinawa, April to June 45.
Okinawa was horrific, 50,000 American casualties. It basically wiped out Japan's remaining defensive capacity outside the home islands, but the cost drove home just how bloody a mainland invasion would be.
And all this time, Japan itself was being bombed.
Relentlessly. Most major cities were devastated by conventional bombing. That Tokyo raid in March 45, 100,000 dead in one night, 60% of the city destroyed.
So by summer 45, Japan is reeling, Germany is defeated, but the prospect of invading Japan looks terrifyingly costly.
Exactly the dilemma facing the new president, Harry Truman, which leads us right into the atomic age.
Right. First, the context. FDR dies in April 45.
Just months into his 4th term. Truman, his VP, takes over, inheriting this immense global conflict and the secret Manhattan Project.
And that project delivers its first bomb test in July 45. Trinity.
Mid-July. Perfect timing in a grim way, as Truman was heading to the Potsdam Conference with Stalin and Attlee.
What happened at Potsdam regarding Japan?
They issued the Potsdam Declaration. Basically, surrender unconditionally or face prompt and utter destruction. No specifics about the bomb, just the threat.
Did Japan respond? The sources mentioned secret feelers.
Yeah, apparently there were some back-channel hints they might surrender if they could keep the emperor, but publicly, they refused the ultimatum.
So Truman has the successful bomb test, the Potsdam Ultimatum rejected, and these chilling estimates of invasion casualties up to 46,000 Americans, based partly on Okinawa's bloodbath.
That's the backdrop for the decision. Use the bomb to force surrender, avoid the invasion.
August 6, 1945, Hiroshima.
Dropped by the Enola Gay? Instant devastation. 80,000 killed immediately, 100,000 injured. Many more died later from radiation, but Japan still didn't surrender.
Then 2 days later, the Soviets declare war on Japan.
August 8th, fulfilling their agreement made at Yalta.
And the next day, August 9th.
The second bomb, Nagasaki. Another 60,000 killed.
And that finally did it.
August 14th, Japan surrenders. World War II is over. Formal signing September 2nd on the USS Missouri.
Now, the decision to use the bombs, hugely controversial then and ever since. The sources outline the main arguments.
They do. One line of thinking, particularly from later scholarship, is that Truman wanted to intimidate the Soviets, show them America had this ultimate weapon as the post-war world was taking shape.
But proponents of the decision say that wasn't the main point.
They argue ending the war quickly, saving American lives projected to be lost in an invasion, was the absolute priority. Intimidating Stalin was secondary, if a factor at all.
What about alternatives, like a demonstration first?
Suggested by some critics, but the counter-argument was, what if it didn't work? They only had 2 bombs ready in August 45. A dead demonstration would be disastrous. Plus, would it have been convincing enough?
Proponents really emphasize the expected carnage of an invasion, right? Based on Iwo Jima, Okinawa.
And the fact that Japan was mobilizing its entire population, women and children included, to fight to the death. They argue the bomb, horrific as it was, saved more lives in the long run, both American and Japanese.
But critics push back hard. Some military leaders, like Eisenhower apparently, thought it wasn't necessary.
Right. Some believed continued blockade and conventional bombing would have eventually forced surrender without the bomb. Eisenhower later expressed his misgivings.
Another major criticism, the emperor. The U.S. let him stay after the war anyway. Why not offer that concession before dropping the bombs? Could that have ended the war?
That's a key what if. Critics argue it might have worked. Proponents might say there was no guarantee, and the unconditional surrender policy was paramount at the time.
There's also the targeting. Were Hiroshima and Nagasaki truly vital military targets? Or were civilians the primary target?
Critics argue they were chosen partly because they hadn't been heavily bombed yet, to better demonstrate the bomb's power, making civilians the main victims.
And dropping the second bomb on Nagasaki so quickly, just 3 days later.
Critics question if Japan was given enough time to understand Hiroshima and react before Nagasaki was hit. Was it truly necessary?
And finally, some argue the government wasn't entirely truthful with the public afterward about why the bombs were used.
Yeah, accusations of managing the narrative through press releases, even movies, to justify the decision and downplay alternatives or moral questions.
It's a debate with no easy answers, clearly. But the outcome was undeniable. War over, atomic age begun.
And that new age, the post-war world, wasn't just shaped by the bomb. It was also heavily influenced by the diplomacy happening during the war among the Allies.
Right, those big conferences.
Yeah.
Casablanca, early 43, FDR and Churchill.
That's where they announced the unconditional surrender policy and agreed. Italy first, then the cross-channel invasion into France.
Then Moscow, later in 43, Cordell Hull for the U.S.
Key outcome there. Getting Stalin to formally agree to enter the war against Japan after Germany fell, and to join a future world organization, the UN.
Cairo, December 43. FDR meets Chiang Kai-shek.
Focused on Asia. Called for Japan's unconditional surrender, return of Chinese territory, and a free, independent Korea.
And then the first Big Three meeting. Tehran, late November 43. FDR, Churchill, Stalin.
Huge. They finalized the 1944 invasion of Western Europe. Stalin reconfirmed he'd fight Japan, but you also see the cracks appearing.
Aye, so.
Big arguments about post-war Europe. Stalin wants Soviet dominance in Eastern Europe, a weak Germany. Churchill wants free Eastern European governments, a stronger Germany for balance. FDR tries to mediate, banking on the UN and his relationship with Stalin.
Next up, Yalta, February 45. War in Europe nearing its end.
Another Big Three meeting, key agreements. Stalin confirms entry against Japan within 3 months of VE Day. Agreement on a declaration of liberated Europe, promising free elections, which became a major point of contention later.
And the UN structure gets nailed down.
Pretty much. Meeting set for San Francisco in April 45. Soviets get 3 General Assembly votes. US, UK, USSR, France, China get permanent Security Council seats with veto power.
What about Germany and Eastern Europe at Yalta?
Germany to be divided into occupation zones. A coalition government for Poland agreed on, communists and non-communists, but USSR keeps territory it grabbed in 39. FDR also makes concessions to Stalin on Soviet influence in parts of Asia. Outer Mongolia, Kurbys, Sakhalin, Port Arthur.
By the time they meet again at Potsdam, July, August 45, the vibe has changed.
Completely. FDR is gone, Truman is in, Attlee replaces Churchill mid-conference. The sources say the alliance is clearly breaking down. Disagreements on almost everything.
But they did agree on some things.
Setting up a council of foreign ministers for peace treaties, war crimes trials, Nuremberg, demilitarization and denazification of Germany. and reparations taken from each power's occupation zone.
And it's during Potsdam that Truman orders the bomb dropped.
Yes, the timing is significant.
Looking at the sheer devastation after the war, the numbers are just numbing.
Mind-boggling. 46 to 55 million dead total. Maybe 30 million soldiers, 25 million civilians. The Soviet Union alone lost maybe 23 million, military and civilian combined.
Plus millions wounded, millions missing, and displaced people.
30 million Europeans lost their homes. Huge refugee crisis. 60% of them Germans fleeing the east.
And the physical destruction. Cities flattened.
Millions of homes in Britain, Germany, Russia, just gone. Infrastructure destroyed.
And then the full horror of the Holocaust becomes clear.
6 million Jews murdered in the final solution, plus another 6 million others, Roma, gay people, disabled people, political opponents, Jehovah's Witnesses, systematically killed by the Nazis.
And the sources are critical of the U.S. response before and during the war regarding Jewish refugees.
Very critical. Points to ongoing anti-Semitism in America, immigration quotas not being filled, even as Jews desperately tried to escape Germany, even turning away ships like the St. Louis, sending people back to their deaths. A real failure.
So as the dust settles, the wartime alliance just evaporates.
Almost instantly. The ideological conflict, communism versus democracy, capitalism, comes right back to the surface. Especially over Eastern Europe, now mostly under Soviet control despite those promises of free elections.
And Germany's fate remained a huge issue.
Soviets want it weak. US-UK want it economically strong and democratic, partly as a buffer against the Soviets. These disagreements set the stage for the Cold War.
And the old powers of Western Europe were diminished.
Completely eclipsed. The US and USSR emerge as the two undisputed superpowers. A bipolar world begins.
What else changed globally?
Nationalism surged everywhere. Colonies that fought for the Allies weren't going back to the old system. India was promised independence. French Indochina resisted the return of French rule. The seeds of decolonization were sown.
And back in the U.S., long-term social shifts.
Definitely. For African Americans, wartime job gains fueled hopes and demands for more progress against discrimination. For women, many saw new possibilities, even if society pushed many back towards domestic roles. And that Sunbelt population shift just kept going.
Technology, too.
Yeah.
Synthetics, radar, aviation.
All boosted by the war. And, of course, the biggest technological leap, the atomic bomb. Ushering in the atomic age, changing warfare and geopolitics forever.
So the end of WWII wasn't really an end, but the beginning of a whole new era, the Cold War era.
Precisely. The alliance against fascism was necessary but temporary. The underlying rivalry between East and West was there all along, ready to reemerge. The seeds were planted right there in the war years and the immediate aftermath.
So wrapping up this deep dive, what we've pulled from these sources is this picture of total transformation. America wasn't just in a war. The war reshaped America inside and out and redefined its global role.
Yeah, from the shock of entry through that colossal home front effort, the social struggles, the brutal turning points on the battlefield, the dawn of nuclear weapons, right up to that tense diplomacy laying groundwork for the next conflict.
It really underscores how those 5 years weren't just a chapter in history books, but a fundamental pivot point.
Absolutely. The consequences just ripple outwards through the decades.
Okay, so considering all the scale of sacrifice, the technological leaps, the social upheaval, the global power shifts negotiated under fire, maybe here's something for you, the listener, to think about. Just how much of the world you navigate today, politically, technologically, socially, was fundamentally forged in the crucible of World War II? How deep do those roots really go?